I commend the bill to the House. Thank you.
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, there are 3 points that I wish to make in the important third reading of this Christchurch Cathedral Reinstatement Bill. The first of those is I cannot think in New Zealand of a more iconic heritage building than the Christchurch Cathedral. It is a building that has stood over the Canterbury Plains for over 140 years as a symbol of Canterbury's both pride but also prosperity. I also think we need to acknowledge that those crippling photos of the Christchurch Cathedral became symbolic of the tragedy of the February 22nd earthquake in 2011. And I think, if we're honest, its image would have been repeated millions of times around the world as symbolic of that major disaster for New Zealand. And that is why reinstatement of that cathedral is such an important part of the rebuild and the recovery of Christchurch. For those of us that have travelled to Europe and you go to some of the cathedrals and buildings that were restored after World War II, I do not think any one of those cities would regret either the time or the money that they spent on the repair of those buildings, and I'm sure future generations of both Cantabrians and New Zealanders will feel exactly the same way in future years when the Christchurch Cathedral is reinstated. The second point I wish to make, Mr Speaker, is about the quite wide-ranging powers that are in this bill that are being vested with Megan Woods as the Minister in charge of the recovery in Christchurch. We on this side of the House are pragmatic. Yes, they allow a minister to issue orders in councils that override the Resource Management Act, the Building Act, our Historic Places Act and many other laws. The only point I would make to members opposite is that I sat in this Parliament and heard my colleague Jerry Brownlee accused of being a Henry VIII, accused of all sorts of sins for identical law, actually under far more pressing circumstances in the immediate recovery of Christchurch and Canterbury. And I'm actually proud that Nicky Wagner and the team on this side of the House has not played that game of saying one thing in government and doing the opposite in opposition. We have consistently, as my colleague refers to it as the sort of Steve Mahari rule, actually National has been consistent both in government and in opposition of being as pragmatic, to be as supportive of possible of Christchurch in doing everything possible to recover it. And I do challenge members opposite to reflect on some of the speeches that they gave and the hard time that they gave my colleague Brownlee when he was doing the right thing for Christchurch in the recovery of that city. The third point I want to make is actually one of tribute. That is a tribute to the work of actually both Nicky Wagner and Megan Woods for rising above the normal argy-bargy of Parliament and working hard on this outcome. It's actually really hard to get all the ducks in a row to be able to reinstate the Christchurch Cathedral. There is no magic formula as to how much the church trust itself should pay, how much the ratepayer should pay, and how much the taxpayer should contribute. The pragmatic deal that sits behind this bill, in my view, has only occurred because whether it has been the Diocese Property Trust, whether it has been the Synod of the Cathedral, as well as both the former Minister and current Minister applying pragmatically and being focused on a solution. Yes, there will be those that are frustrated that it's taken 6 years to be able to get to this point to enable a clear plan for the reinstatement of the Christchurch Cathedral, but Parliament should reflect on the fact that it took over 35 years to build the original cathedral, and in the same way we will get there. I have one last little plea. There is another gorgeous, beautiful Christchurch Cathedral in New Zealand. It's actually the second most visited, prior to the Christchurch Cathedral, tourism cathedral in New Zealand, and that is in the city of Nelson, that I'm privileged to represent. And I do say to the government that actually, rather than waiting for the next earthquake and for the next one of our cathedrals to come down, it is far more economic to strengthen our heritage buildings now than waiting for the next quake and the sort of dilemma that we've had over the Christchurch Cathedral. I was pleased to work with my colleague Maggie Barry in establishing a government fund to assist with the strengthening of those heritage-type buildings. I'd encourage the government, the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance in the House to support that fund and to ensure that we get ahead of the risk, and those iconic sort of buildings like the Christchurch Cathedral, that we work with the communities and strengthen them before we get the next earthquake, so that we don't again face the sort of dilemma that we faced over the cathedral. Again, I commend the ministers that have been responsible for this bill. We should celebrate this plan to reinstate Christchurch's cathedral.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it.
Christchurch Cathedral Reinstatement Bill, third reading.
I call on Government Orders of the Day numbers 2 and 3.
Government notices of motion numbers 2 and 3 relating to the adjournment and sitting programme for 2018 and sessional orders on House sittings.
Mr Speaker.
Right, Honourable Jacinda Ardern.
Mr Speaker, I move